Are you sure the papers are binding?
Yes. She can cry all she wants. It won't change anything.
Does she know everything yet?
I think so. Look at her face.
My name is Lily Carter. I am 33 years old. I didn't ask for more. I didn't ask for special treatment. I didn't ask to be rescued or praised or even understood. I only asked for what was fair. And somehow, that simple request was enough to turn me into the most selfish person my parents claimed to know. The moment still replays in my head with uncomfortable clarity. We were sitting at the same dining table where I had eaten thousands of quiet meals growing up, the same place where I learned to stay silent to avoid conflict. I had practiced what I wanted to say for weeks, rehearsing it in my mind so it wouldn't come out wrong. I told myself if I stayed calm, if I spoke carefully, they would listen. I truly believed fairness was something we all agreed on. I was wrong. As soon as I mentioned my share, the temperature in the room shifted. My mother's face tightened, not in confusion, but in offense. My father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like he was preparing for an argument he had already decided to win. The air felt heavier, like I had broken an unspoken rule by even opening my mouth. They didn't ask me what I meant. They didn't ask why now. They didn't ask how long I had been holding this in. Instead, my mother said one word that cut deeper than I expected. Selfish. She said it like it explained everything. Like it erased every sacrifice I had made. Every time I had stepped back so someone else could step forward. In that moment, I realized how quickly a lifetime of quiet compliance could be forgotten the second I asked for something in return. I tried to explain myself. I reminded them of what we had agreed on years ago, the conversations that had happened when things were calmer, when promises were made casually and never written down. I spoke about fairness, about balance, about not wanting to feel like I was being left behind. My voice shook, but I didn't raise it. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand. It didn't matter. They interrupted me, talking over each other, rewriting the story in real time. Suddenly, I wasn't asking for my share anymore. I was counting money. I was keeping score. I was only thinking about myself. Each phrase landed like a slap, and I felt myself shrinking back into the version of me they were most comfortable with, the one who stayed quiet and grateful no matter what. What hurt the most wasn't the refusal. It was how easily they painted me as the problem. As if my request had come out of nowhere. As if I hadn't spent years being the reasonable one, the flexible one, the one who never made things difficult. The moment I stopped being convenient, I became a disappointment. That night, I lay awake, replaying the conversation, wondering if I really had crossed a line. That's the most dangerous part of being labeled selfish by people you love. You start questioning your own reality. You start wondering if basic fairness is actually too much to ask for. You start apologizing in your head for needs you haven't even voiced yet. By the next morning, the narrative had already spread. Relatives began calling, their voices polite but pointed. They asked if everything was okay, if I was stressed, if maybe I didn't understand how things worked. No one asked what had been promised. No one asked what I had given up over the years. They only knew one thing. I wanted my share, and apparently that made me ungrateful. I realized then how quickly a family story can harden into truth once enough people repeat it. Overnight, I went from being the quiet, dependable one to the selfish sibling who was causing problems. And the worst part was knowing my parents were letting it happen, maybe even encouraging it. I started noticing details I had ignored before, how decisions were always made without me, how my needs were discussed last, if at all. How my willingness to compromise had slowly been mistaken for a lack of boundaries. I wondered how long this imbalance had existed, and how long everyone else had benefited from my silence. There was a deep, aching grief that settled into my chest, not just for what I was being denied, but for what this revealed about my place in the family. I had always believed love meant fairness would eventually follow. That if I stayed patient, things would even out. Standing there, being called selfish for asking for what was mine, I finally understood how wrong that belief was. I didn't storm out. I didn't yell. I just went quiet again, the way I always had. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't submission. It was observation. Something inside me had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't trying to prove I deserved fairness. I was trying to understand why it scared them so much when I asked for it. What I didn't know yet was that this reaction, the anger, the labeling, the rush to make me the villain, wasn't about my request at all. It was about what my request threatened to uncover. And the truth, when it finally appeared, would make that word selfish collapse under its own weight. For a while, the word followed me everywhere. Selfish. It echoed in phone calls that ended too quickly, in text messages that felt carefully worded, in the way relatives looked at me when my name came up. I could feel it shaping how people saw me, even when they tried to be polite. That label had power because it came from my parents, and I had been trained my whole life to believe their version of events before my own. At first, it worked. I pulled back. I questioned myself. I replayed every conversation, wondering if my tone had been wrong, if my timing had been insensitive, if maybe I should have waited longer. I told myself that families were complicated and that sacrifice was part of love. I almost convinced myself that asking for my share had been a mistake. Almost. What stopped me was a quiet, persistent discomfort I couldn't shake. Something about how fast they reacted. How prepared they seemed to be with that word, as if it had been waiting just beneath the surface. Selfish wasn't a response. It was a strategy. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I began to notice how often that label had been used in the past. Not just on me, but as a warning. Anytime someone in the family pushed back, questioned a decision, or asked for clarity, that word appeared. It shut conversations down. It turned reasonable questions into moral failures. And it always worked, because no one wanted to be the person who put themselves above the family. I realized something unsettling. I had been conditioned to confuse fairness with guilt. So I stopped defending myself. I stopped explaining. Instead, I started paying attention. I went back through old messages, emails, and notes I had saved without thinking much of them at the time. Conversations where plans were discussed vaguely, promises made casually, then conveniently forgotten. I noticed patterns in the language, how certainty disappeared whenever specifics were mentioned, how decisions were framed as temporary but never revisited. The more I looked, the clearer it became that nothing about this situation was accidental. Every time I asked for details in the present, I was met with emotion instead of answers. Hurt feelings, accusations, long speeches about gratitude and loyalty, but no facts, no numbers, no clear explanations. That was when I understood the real purpose of the selfish label. It wasn't meant to describe me, it was meant to distract me. Digging didn't start with confrontation. It started quietly. I asked neutral questions. I requested documents under the guise of curiosity. I framed my interest as wanting to understand the bigger picture. The resistance was immediate, subtle but firm. Suddenly, there were delays. Excuses. Statements like, "You wouldn't understand," and "It's too complicated." The same people who had no problem calling me selfish suddenly didn't want transparency. That contradiction fueled something in me. Not anger yet. Determination. I spoke to people outside the family. Not to complain, but to get perspective. I described the situation without the emotional weight attached to it. And every time, I saw the same reaction. Confusion. Raised eyebrows. Questions my parents had never answered. It was jarring to realize how abnormal this dynamic sounded when stripped of the word family. The deeper I dug, the more isolated I became. Information doesn't like to be uncovered quietly. People sense it. Conversations grew tense. Invitations slowed. I was no longer just selfish. I was suspicious. Difficult. Overthinking. Each new label was an attempt to pull me back into line. But something had changed inside me. The guilt wasn't working the way it used to. Every accusation felt less personal and more procedural. like steps in a familiar process designed to keep me from seeing something clearly. There were moments when doubt crept back in. Late nights when I wondered if this was worth it. If peace would be easier than truth. If walking away would hurt less than knowing. Those moments were dangerous because they felt comforting, familiar, like returning to a role I knew how to play. What kept me going was a growing sense of clarity. The realization that if my request had truly been unreasonable, it wouldn't have required this much effort to shut me down. Reasonable boundaries don't need character assassination to defend them. One evening, while sorting through old paperwork, I found something small but unsettling. A document that referenced a decision I was never told about. My name was there, but my consent wasn't. It wasn't proof yet. Not on its own. But it was enough to confirm what I had started to suspect. Things had been decided without me, long before I ever spoke up. The word selfish suddenly felt absurd. I thought about how easily it had been used to override my memory, my instincts, my sense of self. How close it had come to working completely. And I felt a wave of grief for the version of me who would have stopped digging, apologized, and accepted less just to keep the peace. That version of me didn't exist anymore. I didn't know exactly what I would find if I kept going. I only knew that whatever it was, my parents were afraid of it coming to light. And fear, when paired with control, always leaves a trail. I followed it. What I didn't realize then was that the truth wouldn't just explain their reaction. It would expose a choice they had made years ago, one that redefined everything I thought I knew about my place in the family. I didn't find the proof all at once. It came in pieces, scattered and reluctant, like the truth itself had been buried on purpose. At first, it was just paperwork that didn't sit right, numbers that didn't add up, dates that skipped over years where decisions should have been discussed. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself there had to be an explanation. That instinct, the need to be fair even to the people who hadn't been fair to me, was hard to let go of. But the deeper I went, the more the story changed. The first real break came from a document I almost overlooked. It was old, tucked between files that had nothing to do with me, labeled in a way that made it seem insignificant. My name appeared in it again, casually, like an afterthought. And yet the decision outlined there shaped years of my life. It confirmed that something important had been finalized without my knowledge. Not delayed, not discussed later, finalized. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest as I read it again and again, hoping I was misunderstanding. This wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate. The language was precise, legal, careful. Someone had made sure everything was clean enough to stand if questioned, but vague enough to avoid questions in the first place. That was when I stopped feeling confused and started feeling betrayed. The next pieces came faster. Like once the door cracked open, the truth rushed to fill the space. Old emails retrieved from backups. Notes from meetings I was never invited to. Records showing how responsibilities tied to my name were quietly shifted, reassigned, and reframed. The more I read, the clearer it became that I hadn't been excluded because I was irresponsible or uninterested. I had been excluded because my consent would have complicated things. The proof didn't just say I was right. It said I had been managed. I sat alone late into the night, papers spread around me, my mind racing. Every memory I had pushed aside resurfaced with new meaning. Every time I had been told not to worry. Every reassurance that things were being handled. Every moment I felt small for asking questions. It all fit together now, forming a picture I didn't want to see. They hadn't reacted with anger because I was selfish. They reacted because I was close to uncovering something they had worked very hard to keep hidden. What hurt the most was realizing how long this had been going on. Years. Maybe longer. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. It was a pattern. A system built on the assumption that I wouldn't push back, that I would accept emotional explanations instead of factual ones, that I would trust them simply because they were my parents. I thought about the times I had doubted myself, the nights I lay awake wondering if I was being unreasonable, the guilt that had wrapped itself around my chest every time I considered standing my ground. That guilt hadn't been accidental. It had been cultivated. When I finally confronted them, not with accusations, but with documents, their reactions said everything. There was no surprise, no confusion, just a flash of panic before it was replaced with defensiveness. They didn't ask how I found the information. They didn't try to explain the discrepancies. They went straight to minimizing. They said I was misinterpreting things, that I didn't understand the full context, that they had done what they thought was best. Hearing those words, I felt something inside me finally break free. Because what's best had never included asking me what I wanted. It had never included respecting my agency. It had always meant preserving their control. The proof changed the dynamic instantly. The word selfish lost its power the moment facts entered the conversation. They could no longer rely on emotional pressure alone, and that terrified them. I could see it in the way their voices tightened, the way the conversation kept circling back to loyalty and family unity instead of the documents in front of us. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Because being exposed didn't make them crueler. It made them smaller. They weren't villains in some dramatic sense. They were people who had made a choice years ago and built a story to justify it. And now that story was collapsing. But clarity comes with its own kind of pain. Knowing the truth didn't bring immediate relief. It brought grief. Grief for the relationship I thought we had. Grief for the trust I had given so freely. Grief for the version of my parents who I believed would protect my interests even when it was inconvenient. That version didn't exist. I realized then that clearing my name was only the beginning. The real cost of the proof was what it forced me to accept. That I had never been an equal participant. That my role had been decided for me. That the moment I questioned it, the system turned against me. The most devastating part wasn't the money, or the control, or even the deception. It was understanding that if I hadn't asked for my share, if I had stayed quiet a little longer, this would have continued indefinitely. They weren't planning to tell me. They were planning to rely on my silence. That realization changed something fundamental in me. I gathered the documents, organized them carefully, and made copies. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. The truth, once seen, can't be unseen. And I knew that whatever came next, I couldn't afford to doubt myself again. The proof didn't just expose what they had hidden for years. It exposed the cost of believing that love and fairness always go hand in hand. Sometimes, love is conditional, and sometimes, fairness has to be taken, not given. I didn't know yet how this would end. I only knew that the story they had been telling about me was over. And the truth, now out in the open, was about to demand a reckoning they weren't prepared for. I used to believe that truth had a natural power to soften people, that once everything was exposed, once the facts were undeniable, remorse would follow. I imagined difficult conversations, maybe tears, maybe awkward apologies that came too late but still mattered. I thought the truth would end the fight. What I didn't understand was that, for some people, truth isn't a reckoning. It's a threat. When my parents realized I knew everything, something shifted. Not relief, not shame. Strategy. Their voices became calmer, more controlled, as if they had moved from defense to calculation. They stopped arguing the facts and started reframing the situation, trying to regain ground they could feel slipping away. They didn't apologize. Instead, they asked what I planned to do next. That question carried more weight than anything they had said before. It wasn't concern. It was a warning. I could hear it in the pause afterward, the way the room seemed to wait for my answer. They weren't interested in repairing what they had broken. They were interested in how much damage control they would need to do. At first, their approach was subtle. They suggested compromises that weren't really compromises at all. Partial acknowledgments paired with new conditions. Offers that sounded generous until I read the fine print. Every proposal required me to give something up quietly, to agree not to make things difficult, to keep the truth contained. They wanted my silence. When I didn't give it to them, the tone changed. The next attempt came wrapped in guilt. They reminded me of everything they had done for me growing up. Every sacrifice they believed they had made. They spoke as if fairness was something I owed them in return for being raised. As if the past erased the present. as if love was a debt I could never fully repay. Listening to them, I felt a familiar ache rise in my chest, that old instinct to back down, to soften my position, to be the reasonable one again. It would have been so easy to step back into that role, to trade truth for temporary peace. But then they crossed a line that made everything painfully clear. They threatened to take away the one thing they hadn't been able to control yet: my reputation. They implied they would clarify the situation to extended family, that they would tell their version of events before I had the chance, that if I pushed this further, people might start to see me as ungrateful again, as vindictive, as someone tearing the family apart over money. In that moment, something inside me went very quiet. I realized this wasn't about resolving anything. It was about punishment. I had broken an unspoken rule by uncovering the truth, and now they wanted to remind me of the cost. They couldn't take the facts away, so they tried to take my standing, my credibility, my sense of belonging. It hurt more than the original deception, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to see. Even now, even with proof in my hands, they were willing to hurt me if it meant protecting themselves. There was no limit they wouldn't cross, no bridge they wouldn't burn. The love I had hoped would surface once the truth was out simply wasn't there. I walked away from that conversation feeling hollow. Not angry, not shocked, just deeply, profoundly tired. Tired of fighting for space in a family that only valued me when I stayed small. Tired of explaining why fairness mattered. Tired of expecting decency from people who had shown me, again and again, that control mattered more. The grief that followed surprised me. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow and heavy, settling into everyday moments. I grieved the parents I thought I had, the idea of family I had protected for so long. I grieved the version of myself who believed that if she just waited long enough, love would eventually become unconditional. Letting go of that belief felt like losing something essential, but it also felt honest. In the weeks that followed, I made choices I never thought I'd have to make. I limited contact. I documented everything. I stopped sharing details of my life with people who had proven they would use them against me. Each boundary hurt, but each one also made me feel a little steadier, a little more real. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final showdown where everything was resolved. Just a quiet understanding that the relationship I wanted wasn't possible. And that understanding, as painful as it was, gave me clarity. The last thing they tried to take from me wasn't money or control. It was my right to tell my own story. They wanted me ashamed enough to stay silent, afraid enough to disappear back into the background. But the truth had already done its work. I couldn't unknow what I knew. I couldn't go back to believing their version of me. Choosing myself came with a cost, and I paid it in grief, in loneliness, in the absence of something I had spent my whole life chasing. But it also came with something I had never truly had before: peace that wasn't conditional. As I moved forward, I understood that closure doesn't always look like apologies or accountability. Sometimes it looks like acceptance. Acceptance that some people will never choose you, no matter how fair you are, no matter how much proof you have. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do after the truth comes out is stop asking for permission to keep what's yours, your voice, your dignity, your future, and walk away before they try to take that too.